There's a very interesting social or psychological or social psychological social experiment we could do if we wanted to. And it is really, really interesting. All we'd have to do is just use this statement and ask people whether the statement makes sense or not. So we could do that to 1,000 people, say, if we had the time or the inclination. And the statement is, the statement would be something like, controlling creates the false impression that there is a controller, or goal seeking creates the appearance of a goal seeker, and so on and so forth. So we just could use one of those statements. Then the idea is to stop people on the street or wherever and say, does this make any sense at all? So my guess, and I could be very wrong, I could be overestimating the amount of people that would relate to this statement, but my guess maybe could be that 1 out of every 1,000 people would say, yep, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But then maybe it's 1 out of every 5,000 or 10,000. I don't know. I haven't ever taken the time to run the experiment. Possibly it would be 1 out of every 100,000. You could easily talk to 1,000 people anyway, and out of that 1,000, they'd all look at you as if you had two heads, or as if you were being stupid, or as if you were just being a complete plonker. Anyway, that's okay. It's fine. It's not like there's a problem there. But when it comes to health, working in mental health, we need to understand this statement. In other words, we need to be more subtle in our thinking. So if I'm a computer programmer or coder, I need to be more precise. I need to be precise in my thinking. I can't be sloppy. It's just a given. It's a requirement for the job. If I'm working in mental health, I need to be subtle in my thinking. I need to go beyond the obvious. Go beyond the obvious of Aristotelian logic, which is either the cat is sitting on the mat or it's not on the mat. It can't be both at the same time. It's one or either. It's the law of the excluded middle. So unsubtle thinking is Aristotelian logic, which is the type of logic we all use, and it's fine for everyday life. But we need to see beyond it. If we are working in the field of mental health, we need to see way beyond Aristotelian logic. Because Aristotelian logic deals with formal realities. It doesn't deal with the real world. So if I don't understand that controlling creates a false impression of the controller, then I'm going to abdicate controlling. And if I don't understand that controlling reifies the concept of the controller, which, as I've said, we don't tend to, then what that means is I'm going to put all of my eggs in that basket. I'm going to bet all of my money, every last cent. I'll bet your money as well if I can get my hands on it. I'll run up an overdraft on that reified controller. All my money goes onto that. That's the horse I'm betting on because I've just got this feeling it's going to win. I know it's going to win. And so I'm going crazy betting money on it. So betting money on it just is another way of saying identifying with it, throwing one's lot in with it. So if it does well, I do well. If it does badly, I do badly. I'm attaching my colours to it. So when I do that, as we all do it, that's just a given. That's just how things start off, by the process of identification, which happens so quickly and mechanically, we never spot it. We never say, oh, look, there's the process of identification. Look, I just identified with a reified controller or the reified purposeful self. Obviously, I never spot that. It just happens. And when it does happen, everything's switched around 180 degrees. So I'm seeing the world in a totally different way. Not a distorted way, not a version of a different way or a different version of a way. Completely different. It's like a photographic inversion that takes place. Freedom is replaced by compulsion. We don't see this because we've identified with the compulsion, so we think it's us that wants to do whatever the compulsion wants us to do. So we're seeing everything backwards. But anyway, once we have started off putting all our eggs in this basket, then the process from that point on is determinate, which is to say, it's always the same, it always will be the same, it can't deviate, it is a given, it's a total given. And that process is the process whereby we discover that we've put our money on the wrong horse. Now, this can be a very long drawn out process, admittedly, but that's where it's going, and that's the only place it can go. And if we wanted to sort of ask why, it's because that's the truth. We're not the reified controller. We're not the reified controller because it isn't there. It's just a kind of trick of the light that's produced by our controlling. So eventually, the illusion loses its power to blind us, to confuse us, to lead us astray. And the way this happens is through pain. Because whenever there's a very strong disagreement between how I'm seeing the world and how the world is, where there is illusion that I'm acting on, the consequences of that is going to be a mess. It's going to be pain. I'm going to be going against things that are bigger than me. I'm going to be going against the universe, the world, or whatever you want to call it. I'm going to be struggling against the symmetry or the harmony of the universe. And I'm allowed to do that, but the consequences are that I'm going to get lots of knockbacks, and it's going to be painful because I'm trying to do something that can't be done, and yet which I insist on trying to do over and over and over again. So we all know that's a recipe for suffering and pain. That the end result of all this suffering and pain is simply that we see that it can't be done. We learn it. We learn that the dead end is a dead end. It's not a pleasant experience to learn that the dead end, which we have invested in so much, as a dead end, i.e. that reified controller, is the dead end. But we learn it. And so that's how it works. So neurotic suffering is how we learn it. So it's interesting that we call this a disorder. It's not actually a disorder, neurotic disorder. It's order. That is order. That's the harmony of the universe. Nothing less than that. That's the Tao. That's the truth. That's order. It's not disorder. We're the disorder. So that's another example of something we see backwards. So neurotic suffering is how we discover we've put all of our money on the wrong horse. And depending upon our deep down willingness to let go of our illusions or see the truth, whichever way you want to put it, that journey can be shorter or longer, depending on how much we want to cling on to this particular delusion. And as a general rule, we want to cling on to it badly. We're totally determined. This is an example, the supreme example of stubbornness. in some ways, sometimes maybe stubbornness can be a good thing. But in this case, our supreme stubbornness in not recognizing that we've put our money on the wrong horse, or that we've parked a whole life down the wrong road, which is only a dead end, is of course the thing that acts against us, our immense stubbornness, our infinite stubbornness. And that's what it is. That's not just mere hyperbole. Our stubbornness is pretty much infinite. But on the other hand, there's the immovable object, which is the Tao, how things are. And that really is immovable, because it doesn't matter how determined we are, we can't shake it. So despite our infinite stubbornness, we're going to get clarity coming to us in the end that will release us from our suffering against our will. It's always against our will. Mental health isn't something I do because I want to be mentally healthy and I'm going along because it's a smart, reasonable thing to do. Mental health is always against our will. Always. Just as Aeschylus says that wisdom always comes against our will. None of us want to be wise. None of us want to disidentify or disinvest with the reified controller. Damn right we don't. Our entire orientation from beginning to end down to the very last detail is identification. We simply don't have the capacity to question what we're doing. It's got to be right. It's got to be right. That's how ego functions, by never questioning its right to carry on as the ego. Stubbornness is what creates the whole situation in the first place. So that's a very good and helpful understanding of the processes that take place when we're looking at neurotic suffering. And it also indicates what our role is. Our role is supporting the dawning insight whenever it does dawn, not imparting techniques and methods to somehow reverse this suffering, which we do because we see it as a disorder, i.e. something that shouldn't be there. So really we're on the side of right and good to make it not be there and to fight against it. Of course we're going to be taking this viewpoint just as long as we see neurotic suffering, mental suffering, as being a disorder, a pathology. So what we're doing really is adding to the stubbornness. There's plenty of stubbornness there already, to be sure. We're adding to it as therapists. We're adding an extra bit of stubbornness there. We're adding more disorder. We're extending the period of suffering and making the suffering more intense. We're adding extra levels of suffering, extra levels of delusion. Now that isn't really how we would, most of us or any of us, all of us would just see therapy. We don't see therapy as adding suffering onto the plate. So there's somebody, and they've got a big load of suffering on their plate, and we say, hey, don't worry, buddy, here, let me ladle some more on that plate till the plate's overflowing all over the place. We don't see that as what we are doing as therapists, but we absolutely are, unless we can be subtle enough to see beyond the thinking mind in the way that the thinking mind works. Because the thinking mind reifies everything. It's not very good at not reifying. Thinking mind proceeds by identifying goals and then trying to close the gap between where we are and what the goal is as quickly as possible. It's got this immense impatience to close that gap. And that's not helpful, that type of impatience to get things to be the way we think they ought to be, when the way we think they ought to be is back to front and arse ways. It's not helpful, even though it's an immensely powerful reflex, just like the reflex to punch someone who's really annoying us. That could be an immensely powerful reflex. We're thinking, oh, I just really love to just knock you on, smack you on right in the face. But usually we don't do that because we know reflexes like that, obeying reflexes like that, it just gets us in trouble. It's not smart. Some people don't learn. Some people learn it quicker than others. We all kind of tend to learn it. You can't carry on like that, for God's sake. Not once you get above the age of 3 or 4. So what is useful is not getting more and more skillful at obtaining goals, which is an utterly pathetic idea in terms of mental health. Utterly pathetic. What's helpful is what Keats called negative capability, developing negative capability. Whenever he said that, I don't know when it was, a couple hundred years ago, maybe 300 years ago, or 200. So negative capability is defined, or negative capacity, I can never remember which one it is defined by saying it's when we don't act on this, it's the lack of it, the lack of negative capability is when we're always irritably reaching for conclusions. It's this, it's that. Irritable doesn't mean that I'm crotchety and cantankerous and moody. It's just a term from biology. It means that there's a kind of instant reflex to move or to react. You touch something and it goes like that. That's an irritable thing. If you're looking at something on a slide or a petri dish, you touch it with a little thing and it just goes like that. It's irritable. So we're like that. We're mechanical. We just irritably reach for a conclusion. We just want that conclusion because, psychologically speaking, that conclusion means I don't have to think about it anymore. I'm just going to say it's this, and then that's it. I'm going to close the book. I'm going to shut the door. I don't want to think about it anymore. Please. The torment of uncertainty is too much. I just want to say it's this. And in my heart of hearts, though I'll never in 1,000 years admit it, I don't give a damn whether it's true or not. I just want the conclusion. So that's like beliefs, really. When we hit upon a belief, it's not because of the beauty of whatever idea or whatever the hell it is we're believing that resonates so much with us. It's just basically it's because I need a belief. Please give me something to believe in. I don't really give a shit what it is. I just want to stop thinking. I don't mean thinking logically thinking. I mean kind of questioning or looking and not knowing what the answer is. I don't like that. I want to look and know what the answer is. But in actual fact, if I look and know what the answer is, I'm not actually looking at all because I've become totally blind. So negative capability is where we don't do that. The reflex doesn't take over and we sit there and we don't say it's this or it's that or that's the good thing and that's the bad thing. We don't know what's the good thing and what's the bad thing, or if it's this or if it's that, and it doesn't matter because anything at all we say is always wrong because that's only the mind cutting in. Reality itself isn't any of that. Reality is not made up of right answers and wrong answers, this and that, and this is true and that's not true. Reality is nothing like that at all. That's the mind we're talking about there. That's the logic of the thinking mind. Black and white, it's this, it's that. The category. It's in the category of a cat. Therefore, it's a cat, or it's not a cat. It's in a different category. Maybe it's a bandicoot or a mongoose. I don't know, something different. So it's kind of like the ability to tolerate uncertainty or developing. There's a kind of a developing. We don't know where the developing is going to, but we're not going to jump the gun and say it's this, it's that. We're just letting the developing, the becoming, or whatever you'd want to call it, happen. We're just letting that happen because that's what reality is. It's not like a terminal destination that we're going to. There's no destination and there's no starting point and there's no one to go from the starting point to the destination. It's a movement. That's what it is, a movement. The goals don't help with movement. Goals aren't about movement, funnily enough, even though we might think they are. So that's a very helpful thing for us to know or be aware of if we're working in mental health, to realize how therapeutic uncertainty is and how suffering-inducing certainty is by the same token. the other side of the coin. When we're certain about things and when we've identified with a reified controller, which is what we call the self or the ego, then that is a very, very painful situation. Kind of in a way, we jumped to it because we thought it was smart in some kind of way, but no, it's not smart. It's the stupidest thing we could have done. But that's life. That's how we progress. That's how life progresses. By doing the really stupid, obvious thing and then realizing that it is stupid and that the obvious is never true. And then we learn at leisure. We learn at our leisure the errors of our initial assumption, which is great. That's learning. That's how we get to move on in a genuine way. But the reified controller, in its very essence, is suffering. So another question that we could ask people is, or not so much a question, but we could say, make a statement, or definite statements are self-contradictory. See how many people out of 1,000 would say, yep, that's fairly self-evident. Yep. Again, who knows? 1 out of 10,000, 20,000, really don't know. But this is what the reified self is, the reified controller or goal seeker, the one who is seeking the goal. The goal doesn't exist, neither does the one who's seeking it, but we get caught up in this business anyway. More than caught up, it constitutes a whole universe, it constitutes our whole life, which is a pretty odd thing to think about. The reason the reified controller is itself suffering is because it is self-contradictory. It is always conflicting with itself. That's not a good place to be in. So Michel Montaigne, the French philosopher from a few hundred years ago, observed that we have this peculiarity, that to believe in something is to disbelieve in it. The more we believe in something, the more we disbelieve it at the same time. So we disbelieve in what we believe. That's self-contradictory. So I think I'm saying to myself, I believe so much in this thing, and that sounds like positive. It doesn't sound like conflicted, but it is. As when we look into it and try and be a bit more subtle, we say, yes, that amount of intense belief is purely self-contradictory. Why would I need to insist so much that such a thing is true if I wasn't equally convinced on another level that it isn't true? It's merely me trying to disprove trying to prove what I know not to be true. And so what it is a state of denial. Denial is where I say very strongly that this is how it is, when deep down. The reason I'm saying that is because deep down I know that it isn't, and I'm fighting to ignore that truth. So that creates the conflicted state of denial, which is also the conflicted state of the reified controller. And it kind of corresponds to the alchemist's notion of the matter confuser, which is like starting off point, the default position of warring opposites. Everything is just fighting against each other and getting nowhere, because if you've got a bunch of people and they're all fighting against each other non-stop, nothing's going to happen. It's going to be defeats the object right from the first, and that's the matter confuser. That's our starting off point. So that's the reified controller. Okay, thanks for watching.